Welcome. My name is Paul Irving of the Milken Institute, and I want to thank all of you for coming this morning. This is going to be a little bit of a different kind of session. We do this every year, and I want to just talk a little bit about format before I introduce my friend Dave Chen. So we have today with us the winners of the Morgan Stanley Sustainable Investing Challenge. One of the things that the Milken Institute is most excited about is supporting young people, entrepreneurs, who are focused on not just investment returns, but on changing the world in positive ways. And the great thing about this competition and how it's evolved is really the promotion of really talented young people in phenomenal businesses and with great ideas that create really a different view for those interested in this kind of investing. So what they're going to do is they're going to present their plan quickly, and then we want this to be a conversation. So I would really like you to, and frankly, I would encourage people in the audience, if you would, to think about moving up more closely, because we'd like to have you in a discussion with our panelists. We want you to ask them questions. We want you to poke at them. We want you to give them advice. They're going to take that advice to heart. Obviously, we have some people in the room who invest actively, and nothing could be more valuable for them and for us if you'd provide that support. So before they begin, I want to introduce my friend Dave Chen down at the end. Dave's the guy without the tie, demonstrating his sight in the Bay Area. Dave is not only a very prominent impact investor, social investor, but Dave is the CEO of Equilibrium Capital. But I think even more important, and certainly more important to me about Dave's work, is that Dave is really actively involved in mentoring and promoting education and the advancement of students and entrepreneurs who are interested in this area. And I want to congratulate Dave and thank Dave for his great work. Dave teaches at both Kellogg and Stanford, but I do notice that he has a golden bear on his.
I had to take it off.
On his well, okay, you had one earlier, so we won't tell your friends at Kellogg and Stanford that you were doing what you were to support this group from Berkeley. So I'm going to turn it over to Dave, and again, listen carefully. They're going to go quickly through their deck, and then feel free to go at them. We want you to do that. Okay?
All right.
Dave.
Well, first of all, welcome. My name's Dave Chen, and as Paul said, I run a investment firm that's focused on sustainability-driven real assets strategies for institutional investors. So we see sustainability and impact as an alpha-generating opportunity. But today, really, the hat that I'm wearing is that of a clinical professor over at Kellogg, and what we'd like to do this morning is talk a little bit about a couple things. One is sustainable investing and the trends that are starting to take place there. And the backdrop is really to use the winner of the Morgan Stanley Sustainable Investment Challenge, the Haas team, Berkeley Haas team, as an example of the kind of innovative capacity that's coming out. So let me just tell you a brief story, and then we'll kick right into what they're doing. About 6 years ago, we started to see that business schools around the world, and specifically here in the US, started to have intense demands, generally by their sustainability clubs or the responsible business clubs, even at places like Harvard, where they were starting to ask these questions. And the funny thing was, these clubs are starting to become literally from not 10 students, but 50, 60, 100 students, and you started to see the demand for curriculum. And so at Duke, at Kellogg, even at Wharton, Wharton's a funny one, you started to see the beginnings of whether they were called impact investing classes or social entrepreneur classes. Well, the long and the short of it is I started teaching at Kellogg about 6 years ago the impact investing class, and I won't belabor what that entailed and everything, but one of the things that the students were asked to do in that class was to use, and this is what the difference, to use finance as a source of innovation. All right, so everybody here in this room, in this conference, is a financial services professional. We invent and build financial services products, whether they're derivatives or whether they're hedge funds or plain simple active investment public equities. But we're inventing products, and we use finance and the investment capital tool itself as a source of innovation. And right about that time, there was a lot of talk about social innovation and social enterprise. And the question that we wanted to ask the students is, well, look, the entrepreneurship program is really involved in this. What about the finance department and the finance student and the investment student? And how can we engage them in using this? And remember, when we talk about things like carbon cap and trade, when we talk about things like social impact bonds, when we talk about things like even the 30-year fully amortized mortgage as an instrument of social change, we forget that these are financial instruments at the core. All right, these are financial instruments. So what we did was we had this wild idea to start a competition around the world challenging business school students, specifically in the finance curriculums, to invent and bring forth innovative ideas of financial services strategies, investment portfolio strategies that could create a positive benefit for the environment, for our society, and generate a market rate of return, and could scale to actually move the needle and make a difference. In our very first year, 5 years ago, we had 10 teams, the usual suspect top business schools in the United States. And last 2 weeks ago, we just did it our 5th year in London. And we had 127 teams from around the world, well over 350 students participating through various rounds from well over 70 business schools, most of which are schools that probably most of us in this room have never heard of, from literally around the world, and from 20 countries. And it really just shows the enthusiasm when you challenge. We talk euphemistically about the millennials and the innovative capacity in our next generation, and we're watching it happen. So the contest, the competition goes on. We bring the top 10 teams to the city of that year. This year it was London. They shoot it out. We have an august group of judges from around the world in the financial services, investment management, coach them, grade them, and this year we're really pleased that, that the Haas team made it to the top of the stack from 127 entrants from around the world. And with that, I'm going to stop, introduce the Haas team, let them talk a little about how they got here and their proposal. And then we'll open it up for a more open discussion about sustainable investing, what we see happening in the world. So I'm going to introduce Nick, Zach, Lee, and Chad from the Haas School.
You want to start?
Sure. I'm Chad Reed, a second-year MBA at UC Berkeley. And I started my career in the intelligence community. Interestingly enough, I was operating primarily in the Middle East. I then transitioned to do some sustainability finance work with the Environmental Defense Fund, a grant with the Rockefeller Foundation, and now currently in my current role in strategic finance with Sungevity, a residential solar provider.
Hi, I'm Lee Madeira. I started my career in investment banking and then moved on to investment management, where I worked for both an activist firm and a value firm, and a short stint in between where I moved to Ecuador and did a Kiva fellowship with local microfinance institutions.
My name is Zach Knight, financial engineer by background. I started my career at Merrill Lynch working in structured finance and credit derivative structuring, and actually transitioned into trading high yield and distressed bonds before coming to business school. And as you can see from my walking boots, I am a subpar moped driver.
Hi, I'm Nick Wobrock. Before business school, I was in the Peace Corps quite a few years ago, working in water projects in Central America. Then after the Peace Corps, I worked in Portland, Oregon as an environmental engineering consultant on water resource projects, looking at infrastructure, improving systems for the city of Portland and around. And originally, with my background in water, and then moving and starting the business school program at Berkeley, I saw in California, we were in the midst of one of the largest fires in recorded history in the Sierras, right during the first handful of months a couple years ago. And with my background in water, I knew that there had to be some interplay between the fires in the Sierras, the emergency state of declaration that for the past 2 years California has declared, and the impact that that could have on the water systems. And so last year, during the summer, I was provided an opportunity to intern at the Nature Conservancy, where we were evaluating what is the cost, benefit, and the impact from these fires. Fires cost quite a lot to suppress. Billions of dollars have been spent each year for the past few years. It impacts the watershed dramatically with water quality and the water quantity provided. And so we were looking at what's that cost to try and prevent some of these significant fires? And how does that economic analysis, what does that mean for our society to try and address these problems, especially with the resiliency that we're trying to build into our infrastructure? And so together with students at Berkeley, and with my friends, I was learning about social impact investing and this competition. And Zach and Chad and Lee said, let's roll this into a way to try and fund some of these activities.
And I think one of the great things for us is that Berkeley's a very small business school. We have 250 kids in our class. So when I heard Nick talk about this idea, Chad and I were actually finalists and took second place in the competition last year. Said this is an idea we can win with. And I think it's not just about talking to one of the stakeholders here and getting them to put upfront money into this idea, and you're going to see more about that in the presentation shortly. It's about how can we bring investors into the fold here, because we thought there'd be a lot of interest from investors in California, especially, for market rate returns was something that helps alleviate two of the biggest environmental issues in California right now, which are drought and forest fires.
Great, yeah, so with that, this was initially designed as a 10-minute pitch for the challenge, but we're gonna walk through it in a little less formal, more conversational way. So if we could get those slides up there. Great. So of course the challenge we're trying to address, I know many of us today are probably coming from California. You know, most of our state is in a severe drought and has been for a few years now. And indeed, over a third of the United States is in a pretty moderate and serious drought as well. Some are calling it the worst drought in nearly 1,200 years. Now this drought is being exacerbated by climate change for two primary mechanisms. One, in the western part of the United States, we actually get less precipitation than we would otherwise because of climate change. And two, the precipitation that we do get, often it evaporates before it enters the groundwater reserves because of the higher temperatures that we're seeing. Indeed, in California this year, snowpack was at 5% of its historical average. And while that's not a picture of me, it could have been during one of our trips to Tahoe earlier this year. And this matters because usually California's snowpack usually holds as much water as all of its state reservoirs combined. So that it's at 5% of its historic average is a pretty telling sign. Now this drought has a real impact on people, and in particular farmers. It is expected that 23,000 California farmers will lose their jobs in 2015 alone. And if last year is any guide, this will lead to nearly $6 billion in direct economic losses. Right now, there's a lack of cost-effective and affordable solutions. The solutions that do exist are often very expensive. They're either capital-intensive or they're energy-intensive. But what if we could develop a solution that revolved around better management of our existing natural resources? And what if this solution costs less than half as much as any existing alternative and over the long term promoted a healthier environment? Well, we believe we've found such an effective solution. And it is called proactive forest management. Basically, for decades, the U.S. Forest Service, through well-intentioned but actually poorly designed policies, has allowed many of our forests to overgrow. And this overgrowth results in less snowpack, and this less snowpack results in less water in our reservoirs. So how this works is through two primary channels. One is sublimation. So a lot of the precipitation, the frozen precipitation that falls, reaches the canopy, through the process of sublimation, actually evaporates into the atmosphere before it can melt and reach our groundwater reserves. There's also the process called evapotranspiration. So at the ground level, all this extra vegetation and ladder fuels actually consume more of the precipitation and then release it back into the atmosphere, again, before it reaches our groundwater reserves. But through proactively managed forests, we can actually increase that snowpack level, and indeed, through this increased snowpack, for each acre managed in this way, our intervention can generate from 125 to 366 gallons of water per day above baseline. Now that's not just our number or the number of one study, but rather 20 years of research and multiple organizations from environmental NGOs to state and federal agencies have validated this science. And indeed, here is an example. This is the El Dorado National Forest. This picture was taken on the same day, just several hundred yards apart. And you can tell in the picture on the right, the proactively managed forest has a much higher level of snowpack retention. And the benefits from proactive forest management are multifaceted. Not only to get improved water retention that can be used for drinking water or agricultural needs, but this water can also be utilized for hydroelectric power generation. Another benefit is that you get the reduced risk of extreme forest fires. Right now, the US government at all levels spends about $2 billion on forest fire suppression every year. And nearly 20 lives are lost each year in forest fires. So we're hoping we can reduce those costs with our solution. So the question you might be asking, if this is such a great idea, why hasn't it already been done? Well, right now, there are a number of disparate stakeholders that would stand to benefit, but they have no mechanism to share the costs or shift the risk. Right now, the US Forest Service is in a vicious cycle whereby they're spending millions to billions of dollars each year putting out fires, whereas they could have spent a fraction of that money up front in proactive forest management to prevent those fires from happening in the first place. Water utilities, especially those in California, are spending up to $1,300 per acre foot for water, whereas with the solution that we're proposing, they would spend 6 to 7 times less. Electric utilities are under increasing mandates from state and federal governments to reduce the carbon intensity of their generation portfolios, and hydroelectric power generation is often a low carbon and affordable solution. So why now? Well, as we've demonstrated, climate change is exacerbating both drought and fire risk with no end in sight. Additionally, states of emergency have been declared in California due to drought and/or forest fires for each of the last 2 years. And lastly, the US Forest Service is actively looking for partners for fire suppression efforts due to its extreme budgetary constraints. And now Lee's going to talk about how this idea actually works.
Thanks. So Chad did a great job of setting up what the problem is and how forest management can be a solution. And now I'm just going to talk a little bit more about how we specifically structured this investment vehicle. So we've created an innovative platform that brings all these disparate parties together through an investment vehicle that aligns incentives. We start with a capital stack of half debt and half equity to fund this structure as efficiently as possible. The debt and equity investors provide funds to a special purpose vehicle, which invests in forest management. The benefits for both the water and electric utilities and the fire suppression benefits start to be realized immediately, and contracted cash flows from the different counterparties are paid over the life of the investment. The special purpose vehicle then returns the notes to debt investors and the residual cash flows to equity investors. So here's a little bit more detail on the cash flows for the first deal that we've identified. In the first 2 years, we invest $67 million in proactive forest management, and the water and hydropower revenues start to accrue immediately. It's a pay-for-success structure where each counterparty pays for the benefits received, and the fire suppression is assessed at the end of the period, even though the benefits are accrued throughout the entire life of the investment. Now, I just want to mention that there's a range of benefits received. We've used very conservative assumptions, and these numbers still produce debt IRRs of 5% and equity IRRs of 12 to 15%, with a lot of potential upside. And the reason why we use such conservative assumptions is to make sure that we can get all counterparties together and align incentives. Hold on, I think. Okay. So we're very excited about this platform, but we also realize that there are some risks to the structure and have specifically created this platform in a way so as to mitigate those risks. For example, the success is determined through modeling outputs. However, these are models that water and electric utilities have been using for decades, and we're using their same models to determine the success of our intervention compared to what would have happened if we hadn't done the proactive forest management. Not to mention this is much easier than randomized control trials, which most pay-for-success structures rely upon. Speaking of pay-for-success, most rely upon avoided costs, monetizing avoided costs. And while that is one part of our structure, 2 out of the 3 cash flows come from actual revenue generated in the form of water and hydropower. And while utilities are slow to act and risk averse, that's why we've created this the way we have, where the utilities put no upfront capital and only pay for the benefits received. And finally, the Forest Service has budget limitations. But again, that's why they're not currently doing this and why we've shifted the risk and the capital to investors so that the utilities and the Forest Service don't have to pay anything up front and only pay for their benefits received. We're very committed to bringing Blue Forest Conservation Notes to market. This isn't just an idea that we had during our MBA program that we used to win a competition. We really want to make this into something. So I'll just walk through very quickly how we're planning on implementing this. The first step is to identify the target land and the stakeholders, which we've already done. And then we're planning on launching the GP and engaging stakeholders, which we're in the process of doing at the moment, as well as securing investors is the third step, which we're also doing. Finally, once that's all done, we're going to create an independent board to manage future opportunities. Now, once we implement the Blue Forest platform, it can be quickly scaled from the first $67 million project in the Mokelumne River across the western US. Our total investable market is $1.6 billion, and that only targets 10 to 20% of the actual forest land where this treatment will offer the greatest benefits. We're not planning on doing this to the entire forest. It's only 10 to 20%. And we've also identified sites across the US where this can be replicated. And in addition to the initial total investable market, this creates a sustainable source of deals given the 10-year life of forest management. In fact, you can perform the same treatment again after the first cycle, and it is both less expensive and less intensive while reaping the same benefits. And the impact that this intervention will have is considerable. There's, of course, reduced CO2 through the use of hydropower and a decrease in wildfire. But there's also an increase in water resources. And our solution saves firefighters' lives and homes from deadly forest fires while preserving agriculture jobs and expanding employment opportunities to locals. The environmental benefits are certainly significant, but Blue Forest is also saving lives by shifting the demand from dangerous jobs fighting wildfires to sustainable, and local jobs in the form of agriculture and forest management. Finally, we've spoken to a number of advisors to incorporate their feedback and have the support of conservation-focused investors, financial institutions, utilities, and environmental NGOs with significant subject matter expertise. And we think that we're the right team to bring this to market. We have a very diverse team with experience in finance, environmental impact, government, and engineering, and we really look forward to hearing your questions and ideas about how we can bring Blue Forest Conservation Notes to market.
Interesting. Boy, oh boy, my head's spinning. I'm actually curious. Maybe as you begin to think about, your questions for the group, I want to ask. So, what were the toughest 2 or 3 questions that you ran into during the course of the competition?
So Nick and I think could take this. They did a great job presenting it, and we had to handle the questions. And I think Nick did a really great job.
That's called smart leadership.
Exactly right. He did a great job answering some of the science-based questions, and I think it actually got more compelling the more we answered the questions. And I think we got a great laugh out of the audience when they said, we showed our fee structure and all that, and they said, "Are you sure you're making enough money doing this?" I said, "Yeah, I think this is all going to work like that." But if you wanted to hit on any of the scientific questions that...
Sure. So some of the questions about how that range of water that's going to come out of this, how do we have certainty about that? And so in our financial models, we really looked at a low value of water and a low output on that range. That range is citing 2 decades of research of peer-reviewed journals. It's been published about and is fairly certain from the scientific community, but to try and bring that to the broader investing community that would have an interest needs to be broadcast. And so trying to sort of translate science benefit into financial dollars is a language that continues to need to be traversed a bit. So.
Dave.
You know, I just want to make sure that, that one of the things that we do is context setting here. And, you know, I think we talk a lot about, especially if you're in the impact investing or sustainable investing area, about the exciting opportunities that we see in converting what we think of as societal and environmental problems into investment and the use of markets and market making and investment tools to go address them. And we clearly want to recognize and congratulate this team, but I think this is in some ways an example of exactly that. Find a big problem that's incredibly intractable. It's going in the wrong direction from a public policy standpoint, from a cost standpoint. It doesn't take a lot to think about the implications of climate change on this problem, both on the water and on the fire side. And then here's a team that's applying what they learned in school, their experience in derivatives, and asking, how can I take my knowledge, my background, and apply it to a very, very difficult problem? I can honestly say that 127 teams this year did that, and this is a team that emerged, but 127 teams did that, and I think that's one of the most exciting things that we're actually getting to see is that amount of creative capacity being directed at these kinds of problems.
So questions. So let's start with the gentleman right here, second row, and then we'll come back to you. Mike is on the way up.
Hi, Jim Tolosano from Wildlife Conservation Society. I'm interested again in how you did the risk analysis on this. For example, the Forest Service has done this sort of a manipulation before. They were doing forest manipulation like this in the 80s. And they ran into a lot of pushback because you're doing this on public land. So I'm curious how you ran through some of that risk analysis.
Yeah. So certainly. So and part of that was explored when I was at the Nature Conservancy as well, that in the last couple decades, the risk of wildfire has increased dramatically due to climate change, due to drought, due to lack of moisture in the air. Some of the scientists and academics that were working with the Nature Conservancy were looking at and modeling a 10 to 15% of selective thinning, what impact that would have to modeled fires, and really with the goal of trying to reduce the really severe fires. Because there's a greater risk of these severe catastrophic fires, in fact, just like I mentioned a few years ago, the largest in recorded history in the Sierras, there's a greater interest to try, and the additional cost in fire suppression, there's a greater interest in trying to reduce that suppression cost. So the economics are now more in favor of it, especially with interest in these larger, by removing a little bit of the fuel, the selective thinning of small trees, underbrush, not the large trees like we saw in slide 8. By removing some of that fuel, it's actually carbon negative in that if you can avoid those much larger, severe catastrophic fires, there's a lot less carbon emitted as a result. So.
And we actually found out on the day of the competition that the U.S. Forest Service has committed a significant amount of capital to this and similar efforts. I'm not exactly sure of the actual dollar amount. It was up to $1 billion or something, but they're actively looking for solutions for this because of their budgetary constraints.
Fourth row.
I'm Mark Timsky. I'm executive chairman of a large credit hedge fund in London. I'm interested to understand the logic behind the capital structure here. I guess the banks advise you on that, and it's 50% equity, and I can see who would buy that. What about the debt? And can you go through the logic?
Sure. Yeah, so when we were doing this competition, I think one of the factors we wanted to consider is we're pitching this not to people at Morgan Stanley, but we have an audience of banks where they have retail investors. What they're preparing for right now is this wealth transfer of up to $30 trillion from older investors to millennials. This is a key issue for millennials, and banks right now are scrambling to actually find product that they could sell through their high net worth channels. So when we went to structure this deal, what we wanted to do, and I think what makes this different from some of the other pay-for-success structures or social impact bonds that you've seen, is that there's annual cash flows accruing each year. There's not backdated cash flows or one final cash flow here, because the structured finance that you see in social impact bonds, it's not really structured finance, right? We're using PRIs and below market rate investments to help the economics make sense. Here, we have cash flows starting in year 2. And what we're doing with the debt tranche, because there's no asset behind it, these are contracted cash flows from single A+ rated entities, AA+ rated entities, and the US government, is we're using that to amortize the debt tranche over the 8 years, the first 8 years of this structure, with 10 years as the useful life. So that was the thought behind it, and then putting in the credit enhancement below them. And again, sometimes when we talk to impact investing folks, they think credit enhancement can only come in the form of grants. Here it's equity that we'd be raising as the manager, and this is actually the most efficient way to finance this structure. We're pushing the returns for the equities higher by creating a product that investors want. And we actually spend a lot of time talking with folks that do impact investment advisory and with the banks and saying, what's the right term for this debt? What does the return need to be for people to be interested in this? And then we can see what economics that leaves for the equity holders.
Thank you. Another question? Let's go right here, and then we'll come back to you. Oh, well, I guess we're gonna go the other way. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm 20 years working with the United Nations, and we deal with massive global problems, right? So one, I want to congratulate you, Professor, for thinking this through. What we are really looking for now at the global level is innovative solutions to wicked problems. So here you've come together with a methodology to achieve, practical solutions. The group, what we're looking at in terms of scaling social innovation is what's called industry facilitation, because here you're looking at a diverse group of partners that have a vested interest in getting it done, but not one of them will take to the fore and provide that broker platform. So one of the issues that I'd like to hear what your thoughts are is what's your entity, what's your legal entity? Because you're going to face political questions, you're working on public land, you're looking at private, access. So where's the money that you want to make? Where's that going to go to? So your legal entity, what have you thought about that? How are you going to approach that? Thanks.
Great. So I think I'll start off and then you guys can jump in. So one of the things we were thinking about here is that combined, we don't have a background in asset management. And I think going out and trying to raise money for some kind of fund could be spinning our wheels in the wrong direction a little bit. I think, and this is under a lot of Dave's advice that he's given us, is to think about this as a real estate development company and say what we want to do is we want to get this first transaction done in which we're going to raise $67 million. And then we want to do this on a deal-by-deal basis. As Lee mentioned in the slides, we see the total investable market here at $1.6 billion, but we need to take a step back, I think, and say we need to get the first deal done. And because all of these, the entire investable market is on public land right now, the relationship with the Forest Service is going to be one of the key relationships to get this done. And I think this is going to take time. I think we realize that it could be up to 2 years before we're able to price this first transaction. But that's our focus, and it's going to be to build a relationship with that key stakeholder and then use that to engage with the other stakeholders as well.
I think if we pop this up a level, I think that one of the interesting outcomes of what you mentioned is that I think we're entering into a next era of, I'll call it the codification or the training of what it means to create public-private partnerships. And in the last decade, we've used that as a sort of omnibus term to describe bringing together and convening. But if you really think about it, and I like to use complex real estate development as an example or as an analogy. Anytime you want to develop in today's world, it's called a square block of any major city. By definition, your right to do that as a private developer or any kind of financing that goes around that is going to include multiple stakeholders. It's going to include government, potentially regulatory, economic development, maybe a foundation because the city really wants a community center to give you the entitlement to develop that block. There are mixed agendas, and part of the skill set that you have to bring is to understand how to align the interests. And that doesn't mean convening. It actually means an economic alignment of interests or the translation of soft things into economics. And then to be able to build a capital stack, get a transaction done, negotiate. And I think this is actually going to be one of the topics I think that's going to go through the business schools, which is how do you teach this? Because if you believe that more and more of the kinds of business that we're going to be doing into the future with the kinds of investment strategies that we're going to be doing into the future, incorporate this. This has a huge implication for the skill set development, the curriculum development that we want to empower our next generation, our students with. You know, and if you wanted to just be really practical about it, take one of those slides that they presented about the multiple stakeholders, and therein is the you know, the complexity of bringing these together. If you think about it, carbon cap and trade went through the same thing. Every one of the social impact bonds goes through the same thing. Any one of the environmental services markets that we envision is going to go through the same thing. And so you go through the kinds of problems that we're going to start addressing, and you really start to unpack the new skills that are going to be required. And I think this is just an example of that.
Question here.
Sure. So I'm trying to understand a little bit more about what you're doing that's different. For example, you had Lime Timber up there. They've been engaged in sustainable, regenerative, proactive forestry practices for a long time. So you're doing something very different, or is your whole project related to finding ways to bring more capital into this space? And if so, I'd like to know when you're ready to start raising money.
I would say the latter. And Lime Timber is up there also because they were an advisor for us throughout this competition. I mean, I think one of the key differences here is we're going to be more focused on public land. But yeah, that would be the way that we're looking at this right now.
And again, I think the innovation is how we align the economic interests of these stakeholders, these three different stakeholders. And that's really the innovation that we're bringing in addition to kind of the financial structure. It might be slightly different than what Lime Timber is currently doing.
So I've got a question. Dave referenced, you know, a change in education. When you're dealing with public entities, things get messy and sloppy and difficult, and the learnings in business school become learnings about public policy and all the rest. I noticed that you didn't have, and this is the old lawyer talking in me, you didn't have at the front of the deck your risk factors section. So what I want to hear is so what could go wrong? What should people be concerned about, and how do you address those risks?
Yeah, so we talked about a few during the presentation and talked to a lot of different people to really understand the full risk environment, and that's partly why we've structured it the way we have, where you only pay for benefits received, and the amount that the utilities and the Forest Service are paying is very generous. They're keeping the vast majority of the benefits received. So I think that helps align the stakeholders, and also in terms of the Forest Service, they've done deals like this before. There's nothing new about them doing this proactive forest management, and what they've done in the past is they've had to put the capital up front. And they've worked with utilities in order to make this happen, and they've paid for it up front. So if they're willing to pay for it up front, then they should be willing to pay for a portion of it after seeing what the full benefits are. So it's actually less risky than some of the approaches they're already doing.
Are there conditions, and maybe I should know this, but conditions associated with literally the physical work, the nature, because I assume they've subcontracted these relationships elsewhere. So will they specify to you who's actually doing the cutting?
Absolutely. So the Forest Service typically bids out a lot of this thinning work already. Oftentimes the allocation for funding is spread across all 18, 17 forests in California equally, and there's not any large enough allocation to make an impact in terms of fire suppression reduction. But the Forest Service is nothing new with them bidding out to contractors with very strict specifications, what sort of diameter of trees and greater you have to leave, how the thinning and underbrush should be removed. It's not really too novel there. The land that was chosen in these examples were proximate to fire service roads on flat areas. So again, there's not much risk with the places that the thinning would occur as well.
I noticed that there wasn't a lumber recovery piece. Is there another revenue stream there that maybe is somehow less politically appealing, but maybe equally financially appealing?
Great question. A lot of the wood that would be removed is pretty low value. It's because it's small diameter trees or brush. The cost for thinning would be a net cost, where some of that wood could be hauled by contractors to biomass incinerators. We assumed $1,000 per acre of thinning. Forest Service can get anywhere from $500, sometimes up to $1,300, $1,400 per acre of thinning when they bid out contracts. So we used a higher end of that cost.
Good. Let's go here and then up to the back, front row. We can get a mic up here, and we'll come back to you.
Hi, the attractiveness of the equity piece that you're selling, I think, is probably very reliant on the success of the debt piece, where you'd have a far lower return, probably not a marketable one.
Mm-hmm.
Could you amplify a little? The gentleman a couple rows back asked about the debt structure. What, in your mind, or contractually exists in the terms of the relationships with your partners that actually makes you think that this qualifies as a debt instrument that really isn't just equity dressed up as debt?
Sure. I mean, I think personally, it's the contracted cash flows here. And I think that's one of my biggest problems.
But the cash flows roll as you receive them.
That's
There's
correct.
no take or pay contract. There's no guarantee of cash flow. You have to, the recipients have to have the benefit, have to realize the benefit, so
Right.
they have to believe in your service producing that in order for the debt holder to have anything, to get his money back.
Yeah, absolutely, that's correct. And so when we went through and we modeled this, we used the lowest amount of water for the 20 years of history of how much water this has generated. We used a price that we think East Bay Mud would be happy to pay more than. They're paying, $600 an acre foot for emergency water practices. We started this at $200. That'll be a negotiation as well. Even with all of these cash flows and taking the low end estimate on everything, not only do you have enough cash flow throughout this structure to pay off the debt, you still get a low single digit return to the equity holders. And this is going to be a simple waterfall. So you're going to have the cash flows coming down to the debt holders. That's going to amortize on an annual basis, and then leftover cash flows paid to the equity holders. As that amortizes down, those cash flows to the equity holders become greater.
And I would say my brief experience in the solar industry is not so different from the solar loans that are now being offered to residential consumers, right? Right now, in a lot of places, it's unsecured. It's secured only by the system. And so there's no recourse, outside of that. So, and you're not going to get your money back if you take the system and it doesn't produce anything. So I would say it's somewhat similar because you're projecting contracted cash flows. And it's been attractive to a number of investors in the solar loan space, at least in the U.S.
Couple questions in back.
Yeah, actually, kind of in follow-up to the previous question, you thought a lot about who you're partnering with on the stakeholder side, but have you thought about who you're partnering with as you go out and raise capital and find people that understand that capital structure and the value? Because it may not be a traditional debt product, as previously mentioned, but there are allocators that are creating complete portfolios across impact that would actually be really interested in that type of debt structure. How do you go about sourcing those and actually thinking or being a little more thoughtful about going out on the fundraising side and utilizing those investors as actual stakeholders as well?
Right, so this was feedback that we'd received from our first few conversations here. These are with impact advisors that advise any number of clients from high net worth individuals, family office groups, asset management firms. We did talk to the banks too, and my background at Merrill Lynch, we created products for retail investors. Not obviously in this space, but with similar sort of structures. So that's what informed us thus far. These are conversations that we're going to continue to have over the next year or two as we bring these stakeholders together and get these contracts inked.
And we've talked to people at Imprint, Sonnen, and we gave them our pitch, and they said, great, good luck. No matter what happens, we want to make this happen. So come back to us, let us know when we can start offering this to our clients, specifically on the debt side. So there's a lot of interest.
We have a question.
Will the debt qualify as green bonds? Because some institutions have allocations specifically to green bonds, and to be honest, they can't find enough product right now.
Right, that's going to be a goal, and especially as you look to how this will scale. The first transaction, that's something that we're going to work on, but if you look across the opportunity for the debt on $1.6 billion that refreshes every 10 years, this has to become a green bond, I think.
And then there's a lot of privately owned timberland. I'm from the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan in Canada, and we have timberland holdings in the U.S., not, I don't think, in California. But could this be an additional kicker for privately owned timberland, where you could add some additional cash flow by doing this? Or, now they already thin. We manage our forests somewhat, so they're thinned a little bit. So whereas probably the U.S. Forestry Service doesn't necessarily do that, or is it of less benefit because we're already thinning the scrub, et cetera?
I think that if I can address the green bond issue, I think you've hit on really what's starting to happen here. And if you've been monitoring green bonds, we saw this start in the 2007-2008 timeframe as basically full faith and credit issuances from the DFIs. But that's rapidly changed to the last 24 months, where we've seen now both corporate issuances, and now we've seen the first tranches of project-related green bonds, and all have slightly different, obviously different credit risks and risk ratings. But you're precisely right. You know, I just spent a week in Europe with life insurance and sovereign wealth funds, and everyone was excited to tell us about their green bond program. And when you have everyone like that trying to accumulate green bond issuances, and the total issuances last year, I think, were somewhere around about 25 billion. You've got a really interesting market opportunity here. And so out of the chute, this wouldn't be necessarily, obviously wouldn't be rated, but you can see where the trajectory of this goes.
Yeah. And with regard to the question of could this be an additional cash flow for the private land, it could if there's already forest management going on or underbrush clearing, depending on how intensive that is. We're looking at, again, 15 to 20% of the watershed needs to be thinned, leaving the big trees, but to really reduce the risk of wildfire. So if there's an opportunity to increase that activity, you would then be able to see an increase in water flow as well. Part of what makes this structure attractive, unlike a lot of, more competitive than maybe some social impact bonds where you need randomized control trials to see what was the impact of this intervention compared to no intervention. The utilities often have very dialed in precipitation flow models that show, based on how much snow and precipitation and rain, what volume should we expect in the rivers or in accumulating in the reservoirs. And so assuming that there's a counterparty to contract for that additional water and that there's the sophistication to measure that increased flow, then it could be quite attractive for a partnership.
I sort of want to follow up on that topic because electric and water utilities, their revenue contract here is the sort of the underpinning of all those returns on the debt and equity side. You know, if you've got volumetric or price risk, it's going to look totally different. How do you get the electric and the water utilities to the table? What does that contract look like? Because, like I think you already said, it's not a take or pay. Is there volume risk? I mean, who's taking that risk? The debt's not going to take that risk, right? So how do you actually get them to the table and quantify the benefit that they're actually paying for, and how much risk is there to that benefit over, sort of the 10-year life cycle?
Yeah, so this is actually what Nick worked on at the Nature Conservancy, and the output of all of the economic work that they had looked at there was that there's actually enough value in doing this proactive forest management for the water utility alone to pay for it. So when you think about it that way, that bringing in other stakeholders, if there's one stakeholder that gets enough value out of this to pay for the whole thing themselves by bringing other stakeholders to the table, everybody's sharing the cost. And that makes this much more economical than any one of the other options that they have.
Yeah, one of the other options that we looked at, to put a little more color to it, is a recycled reclaimed water plant they built in Richmond with Chevron. It's all public because East Bay Mud publishes everything. They spent $60 million for a 4 million gallon per day plant. That doesn't include all the operation and maintenance, which is it's quite energy intensive. These activities we're looking at are $67 million. And on the low end of water produced would be 7.5 million gallons per day. At the high end, depending on the water response, it could be upwards of almost 20. And so looking at the cost effectiveness, for a water utility, they're often looking at what is our lowest cost alternative to meet these future demand needs. Depending on the scarcity of water, makes this project a lot more attractive and brings people to the table.
And in terms of getting the utilities to the table, this is one of the great things about winning this competition is we've been approached by East Bay Mud. They contacted us and asked us to come in and speak to their board about this opportunity. So we didn't even have to go knock down their door. They've already gotten in touch with us and want to hear more.
And the extreme drought that we're facing is pushing a lot of these utilities to find cost-effective solutions, and we think that's a strong motivation as well.
Could you please explain some of the novel...
Speaking of the mic, thank you.
Thank you. Would you please explain some of the novel aspects of how you're reducing the cost per acre foot from 500 to 200?
Sure. So the $200 is what we modeled with the contribution from the water utility to show that could, based on the water response, could still, with additional payments from the electric utility as well, comparable, at valuing For the electric utility, we could assume per every acre foot how many additional megawatt hours could be generated and giving them a price. That price sharing at $200 for the water utility and $35 a megawatt hour for the electric utility, far below market prices, still can cover the investment in this.
So just to be clear, that $200 is what the water utility is paying for the water that we're generating. So we're not saying that the cost of forest management is $200. What we're saying is that from the perspective of the water utility, their other options could be over $500,000, and we're charging them $200. And the reason that we can charge them $200 is because we're also including the benefits of the hydro and the fire suppression. So if the water utility were to do this on their own, just for their own benefit of the extra water, it would be more expensive. But they're kind of cross-subsidizing. All the stakeholders are cross-subsidizing each other and allowing each stakeholder to get a much better deal because they're sharing in the costs as well as the benefits.
Other questions? Well, so I've got a question for the audience. So we have 20-something minutes left. They're going to be at fundraising, and while this isn't specifically a fundraising session, your input as investors and as prospects in that sense, as advisors, would be particularly valuable to this team. So here's what I'd ask you. If I said to you, what is the one suggestion you have about the nature of their presentation? Can be personal, can be who's answering what questions. A major question that needs to be answered, or things that you think need to be clarified or corrected in their deck, in their approach. I'd like to hear 2 or 3 ideas out of a group of you for them. So here's a gentleman in the back.
I mean, my observation is really it's a project finance vehicle, and so the structure and the mechanics around the revenue contracts are critical. That's the gating item for any project finance, either lender or investor. So I would just, graphically or even legalistically, whatever you can do to put some more flesh on that. Advancing those contract discussions, I think, is probably the first step, because I think that is where most investors at the project level are going to focus.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have another one back there. Right here. Sir?
Well, first, thanks for a great presentation. I actually have a lot of experience with public-private partnerships, and this looks like a great team to me. So one of the questions you didn't answer is, how do you all keep eating until you pull this off? And I think
question.
you must, right? I mean, how do you keep this team together and keep eating until there's money that can then pay you to do what I think is a fantastic idea?
It's a great question. Each one of you want to try that?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And we've actually thought quite a bit about this before coming to the conference, given the audience that's going to be here. What we think it's going to take in terms of time is probably close to 2 years to work everything out here. And what we're looking to raise to cover operating costs, some of the legal fees that will be associated with this, is $1.8 million now. And then that would also incorporate some of the time it would take us to fundraise once we have all these contracts locked in.
But if anybody has a basement available.
Yeah.
Others?
So I'll be working full-time when I graduate, and so this will be a part-time role probably for me. And I know,
but not for the 3 of us, because
not for the 3 of you, but
we're very understanding partners.
Yeah.
So great suggestion. We should come back to that. The question.
We're used to being negative $60,000 a year, so going from that to neutral actually is a pretty good upgrade.
Challenge. Other suggestions for them? Gents, up here. So I've got a question for all of you. How has this process changed you? I mean, from the time you submitted your application to Berkeley, you took your first year of required courses. Obviously, this has been quite an adventure, and I'm curious to hear from each of you how the competition has changed you, how this process of developing this plan has changed you. Maybe not just changed you individual, changed you in terms of the relationship with your colleagues. You want to start down on the end?
Yeah, sure. So thanks. Yeah, when I applied to business school, a little bit frustrated as an engineering consultant, sort of working on problems more put in the box of what we're designing and what are the constraints, and wanted to see the broader sort of world in terms of how to address really big systematic problems. Berkeley was very great with the culture. There's an energy resource group that I've been a part of as a student club at the MBA with, as well as the rest of the school involves a lot of students. And I've learned a ton about innovation as well as the business side of structuring these deals. But then, even more fortunate, the venue of the Morgan Stanley Sustainable Investment Challenge really allowed me to sort of put that lens on how do we solve the big problems that I cared about before Berkeley too, but using the lens of business. And it was just a really great venue to be able to try and grow that muscle. So.
For me, I wrote a really idealistic essay as to how I was going to use structured finance to save the world. I had honestly no idea how I would do it, and without somebody with the specific science background that Nick had in working with a great organization like the Nature Conservancy, it would have never come out. But more than that, without having the opportunity that Dave has provided us and the folks at Morgan Stanley to say, we really need finance people to come in here and take a look at some of these problems. In Berkeley specifically, as I'm sure some of you guys know, there's a lot of people with great intentions, but to be able to put that financial rigor into some of this is what's really exciting to me. And this is a problem that matters to everybody in California and frankly everybody in the Western United States.
Yeah, I would echo that as well. And I came to Haas with pretty much a traditional finance background and looking to combine that with social impact. And it all sounded good in my head, but I wasn't exactly sure how that would happen in practice. And so when we found out about this competition, actually right at the beginning of our first year at the Net Impact Conference, and we met just about weekly or biweekly for a couple months, just throwing out ideas. And I think that's something that I hope I'll be able to replicate that at another point in my life. But it was amazing. It was incredible to just meet with smart people, talk about problems, both social and environmental, and how we could change that by using investor capital and using our experience to create a structure that brings everyone together and solves this problem. And that's something that was just completely very invaluable. And I still think back to some of the problems we talked about and think if maybe that there's another way that we could approach things. And so that brainstorming has really been a great experience. And I'm sure if I were to see myself on stage now 2 years ago, I would have been impressed because I didn't think that I would have learned all this and known, like I didn't know anything about forest and timber and had no idea what forest management was up until a couple months ago. So it's been really great learning both more on the business side, but then also on the social side and how to combine them.
Almost immediately before I came to Haas, I was working with the Rockefeller Foundation on a grant to accelerate financing to smart, sustainable city urban level projects. And so we had actually convened a meeting in Bellagio shortly before I came and with all these amazing stakeholders. And so this is precisely the reason I came to business school, and really honored that Dave created this competition and that we found out about it and were able to compete both years in it during our tenure here. And so I'm working in the solar industry now, so it is also, I think, a hub for financial innovation to support what I would consider very sustainable investments and goals. So this has been just a great experience to kind of hone my financial acumen, my strategic acumen, and my innovative acumen, and also working with some really talented folks here. We definitely couldn't have done it with all of us together, I think. We needed each other. So it's been a great experience.
So I've got one question on leadership and management. Dave, I'll come to you in a second. So the team was expressed well, and people have said impressive team from a range of backgrounds. Who's running this business?
It's funny, we joked in the car ride from the airport what positions everyone would be. And maybe Lee's the CEO. I don't know how we finally came down on that, but
I think Zach and I are going to battle it out.
Yeah.
I mean, one of my suggestions would be, I think at the end of the day, leadership counts, right? And the world's greatest plan executed inefficiently is not going to be successful. So people want to know who's accountable at the end of the day, and I certainly would. Dave?
How many folks in this room went to business school? Another graduate, maybe legal or public policy? Okay. So let me just ask you, you guys got to hang out at this competition with 9 other teams from around the world. You know, Singapore, Europe, Canada, and then 5 U.S. teams. What did you come away with in terms of any shared experiences among these business school students? And then, more importantly, what do you want to counsel the dean of your business school to prepare the students for tomorrow? All right.
That's a great question, Dave. For Chad and I, we got to compete both years and actually have stayed in touch with finalists from the prior year and got a couple nice LinkedIn messages after winning this year and getting over the second place hump. But I think the second part of that is probably the more interesting part. We spent a lot of time talking with Dave after the competition about what they do at Kellogg. And there is a class that exposes students to a lot of aspects of the impact investing space that you won't see normally, and it's not in the Haas curriculum. And one of the things that Chad and I have spent a lot of time kicking back and forth is how can we bring a class like that to Berkeley, where ultimately the kids that go through this class, the teams that go through this class, will submit prospectuses into the competition. And that's probably why the Kellogg team has won every year prior to this one. So that's something that we definitely want to start giving back to Berkeley immediately.
I will say too, when we were, one of the teams, I think from Canada, had mentioned they heard that we had a social impact fund or a socially responsible investment fund that I think Chad, Lee might both be a part of. And they just heard about that. And they said, we would love more information about that. We want to bring that to our school. And some of the cross-pollination and sharing of experiences, we put you in touch. I think there was some emailing and some sharing of materials. And individuals and small groups within big organizations can really raise the volume about certain things that could be included or should be included depending on interest. And that was a pretty impressive sort of opportunity to interact with those other teams and see where the shared interests are.
And did it create a different global perspective? I mean, several of you have had significant global experience, obviously, Peace Corps, et cetera, but did this interaction with people from other places change things? How?
Yeah, I think it definitely helps. So last year I competed in the MINT finals, the MBA Impact Investing Network and Training, which is hosted by Bridges Ventures. And the final competition is at Wharton every year. And we compete at Haas. So it's kind of, it's similar competition, similar idea, but it's more the impact investing, especially venture capital space. So it's slightly different than the Sustainable Investing Challenge. And with that, when we went last year and competed, we had a whole session in between the morning pitches and the afternoon pitches where we just met with other schools and we talked about, hey, what are you doing in order to help this program and create more students who are interested in impact investing, and to teach students this skill of conducting due diligence and reading term sheets. And some schools have specific classes, like Zach was talking about with Kellogg, they have specific classes dedicated to this. Others, at Haas, we have a club and we try to do a lot of teachings and shared learnings through the club. But it's great to just sit around a table with MBA students from all over the country and all over the world and hear about what they're doing at their school to advance social impact. And that's partly how we've gotten some ideas at Haas that we're implementing at the moment.
Others?
Yeah, I would say the coolest thing for me was actually hearing the team that took second place in the competition. They pitched a fund that would help relocate displaced folks in Colombia, given the turmoil that's been going on there for the last 40 years. It was a problem I didn't know anything about, and it was a really cool structure that's something that you can draw back on these experiences and think, okay, so they did this like that. How could this apply to some other problem? So I think it's an exposure thing to issues you've never heard about, and then the way that all these different business school students approach these problems really is going to be a helpful thing for us going forward.
So what questions would you have for the audience? I'll come back to you, but I'm curious. So how many people are longtime Global Conference attendees in this room? There got to be several. So some of you could have been sitting up here many years ago doing the same thing. I'm interested to know, if you're sitting out there 20 years from now, what would you be asking your older self? Again, as an investor, business creator, entrepreneur, or conference attendee.
Yeah, I think one of our main asks is if you have any advice, if you have any introductions that you can make, we would love to speak with you after. We're trying to make this happen, and so anything that you can provide us to help us make this transition, it would be great. So we would just love to hear from you either at the moment or after the panel and speak with you individually.
Others?
So one of the questions came from someone who called this a wicked problem. And I think that's something you hear in the world of corporate social responsibility. And I think it's true here. And I think we're going to need all the help and support that we can get to really make this a reality. We think this financial structure makes sense. But one of the first things they beat into your head at Berkeley is you have to be good at taking feedback and receiving feedback. And you always have to ask for feedback. And I think Dean Lyons' tagline is, feedback is a gift. Mm-hmm. So that's what we would ask for first and foremost from all of you, because you all come from different walks of life and will have different perspectives on how to tackle this challenge.
Others? Dave?
Can I make a couple closing comments?
Yeah.
I think that one of the most important things, and you're in this room because you're interested in either impact investing or sustainable investing, and I think that actually those two words actually are starting to have very separate meanings, related but separate meanings. But the observation I would make, and it has a lot to do with everything that's rippled through the last 10 or 15 minutes as we've talked about business school, and that is if you, and it is taped, but if you taped this session and compared it to the first year we had this session here at the Milken, the language that's being used in the room is actually very different. And in fact, many of the participants in the room come from a very different demographic. The first year was very much more of, when we did this 5 years ago at the Milken, the audience was much more driven towards the NGO, foundations, very, very interested, high net worth. And today, if you look at the drift of the questions, I mean, some of you went right after really the technicalities of debt structure, of equity structure, of counterparties. You went right after the structure. And the vocabulary and the conversation in this room today is fundamentally different. It is that of the intersection of very gnarly, important, wicked, environmental and social problems, but being translated now into how can I create financial instruments? And ultimately, a financial instrument that the Ontario teachers would like to put into a green bond portfolio. So notice, we're not talking about a foundation putting it in. We're now actually talking about one of the most shrewd, sophisticated investment portfolios in the world, the Ontario teachers, talking about this as a capital instrument in the future. You've got a bunch of hurdles you got to get through, but in the future. So I think this today, in a funny way, encapsulates a number of the trends that are taking place. The movement from this being a soft conversation to a very hard conversation, although it still has to have an absolute awareness that we're working within the public sphere. We're now migrating from the beginnings of this conversation, which started with high net worth individuals, now moving to an institutional conversation, increasingly. All right. And we're also now talking about the professionalism and the professionalization of this sector from very, very committed entrepreneurs that really didn't come from the investment background to now the next wave of financiers, asset managers, innovators, instrument product developers are going to come from a much more professional, grounded background. And you can see the dialogue changing in the business schools, where this dialogue originally started 5-6 years ago within the clubs and within the corporate social responsibility departments, the organizational dynamic department, or maybe the social entrepreneurship department. It's now actually drifted into the core of finance. So I made an allusion to this earlier on. Take a look at Wharton. Wharton's had a really interesting situation where you would think this is obviously by definition the place where you go to become a hedge fund manager. And you learn your basic skills. And it's interesting that enrollments in those classes have been either flat or slightly declining. And the impact investing class that is inside the finance department is now teaching 3 sections of 60 students and is the inclining. And what they're trying to teach them is the fundamental basics. My quip that I use is, in the next decade, if you want to change the world, you better learn your way around a spreadsheet. And I think that what we're watching at Wharton is exactly that, is the application of the spreadsheet, the application of risk pricing, all the basics that we were supposed to learn in finance now being applied in a slightly different way. And hopefully today, obviously we're celebrating the Haas team and their great idea, but I also want to highlight the fact that they are merely an example of, I think, a much, much broader drift that's starting to take place in our business schools, and frankly also in our public policy schools, and well, even in our natural resource schools, which is how can we apply the rules and tools that we all learn in economics and in finance into this discipline and into this opportunity. So congratulations and thank you.
Congratulations and thank you. And I would just say in closing is as important as the intersection between social impact and finance is. At the end of the day, we also need people who really care about positive change. And I think one of the great things, not just about the competition, Dave, and congratulations to you for building it. It's had phenomenal trajectory, and I know it will continue to. But to groups like yours and so many others, it's heartening for us who care about a better world to see people with talent, and I think particularly people with business inclination, looking for solutions that we so desperately need in this area and so many others. And by the way, as a Californian, although by the way not a Berkeley grad, but my chairman proudly is, I want to congratulate you as well. Keep up the good work, and I hope this really works out successfully for you. Congrats.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
And next year's competition is going to take place in Hong Kong. This year, just a couple weeks ago, was London, Hong Kong. So we're truly making this a global thing. If any of you are deeply, deeply involved with your business school and want to help out here, please see me. And then we're always looking for sponsors. So thank you.
And say hello to the students. Thank you.